beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Greetings, welcome back, and as always, thank you all so much for joining us today. The U.S. Department of State has issued a press release entitled Disrupting Iran's Transnational Ballistic Missile and UAV Procurement Networks in Support of UN Sanctions on Iran. Yesterday, the U.S. sanctioned 32 entities and individuals based in Iran, China, Hong Kong, and the UAE, Turkey, India, and other jurisdictions that operate multiple procurement networks supporting Iran's ballistic missile and unmanned aerial vehicle production, including on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Why is the U.S. doing this now? Is there additional mischief afoot? How concerned is Israel about these developments? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each program, my guests and I connect the dots between current events and the broader historic context in which they occur. Let's take a look at a couple of today's headlines. The Washington Post reports longest government shutdown in U.S. history ends after Trump signs funding bill. Late last night, President Trump signed a bill to reopen the United States government after 43 days of widespread disruptions and delays. The longest government shutdown ended last night. And speaking from the White House, Trump blamed the shutdown and its harmful effects squarely on the Democrat Party and portrayed its end as a Republican victory. This all came to a head when 7 Democratic senators and 1 independent, who caucuses with them, voted late Sunday to reopen the government and end the shutdown. Why did they fold is one question. Is it possible that in losing this battle, they could position themselves to win the war? Well, we're going to have to wait until next month to see the answer to those 2 questions. Reuters reports Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says, "We hope Washington will take no steps to escalate Ukraine conflict." He said in an interview published late yesterday that he hoped Washington would take no actions liable to escalate the Ukraine conflict. He said Trump had long advocated dialogue with Russia, had sought to fully understand the Russian position on Ukraine, and, quote, demonstrated a commitment to finding a sustainable, peaceful solution. We are counting on common sense and that the maintaining of that position will prevail in Washington and that they will refrain from actions that could escalate the conflict to a new level, end quote. This, while remember, in 2025, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio said the U.S. is engaged in a, quote, proxy war with Ukraine, end quote. And it's the United States helping Ukraine and Russia, and it needs to come to an end. Well, if Ukraine is operating as a proxy for the United States, then the United States should go ahead and end the war. Lavrov said they're counting on common sense. What he needs to remember, and with all due respect, sir, common sense isn't all that common. And one more data point. President Putin has issued a 3-word vow to Venezuela as it ramps up support for Maduro. Lavrov stated that Russia is ready to fully act within the framework of the obligations that are mutually stipulated in this agreement with our Venezuelan friends. Obviously, Russia believes it can fight two fronts simultaneously. And finally, the Biden administration had intelligence that Israel was using Palestinians as human shields. Despite the practice being a war crime, Biden officials did nothing to curtail military aid to Israel and stop using civilians in that manner. And this data point, in my opinion, supports the position that as so many people get caught up in Trump derangement syndrome, a lot of the reckless, feckless, and imperialist policy is not the Trump administration's policy, it's American foreign policy. Remember, Biden was very clear sitting next to Netanyahu in the Oval Office when he said, quote, "I am a Zionist," end quote. The issue before us today, the Defense News reports tensions between Iran and Israel are once again reaching a dangerous peak. Intelligence reports cited by the New York Times, warns that Tehran is preparing for a much larger and deadlier confrontation than before. Iran's missile factories are working around the clock, and its military is reportedly building the ability to launch up to 2,000 missiles at once at Israel, a dramatic escalation compared to the 500 missiles fired over a 12-day period during the June 2025 clash. How concerned should we be? Let's talk to my guest. He lectures on international security issues, Islamic Christian relations, the Middle East, terrorism, and the role of religion in shaping one's perspectives of global affairs. He also covers the origin and development of the U.S. Constitution, federalism, political participation, the national election process, public policy, civil liberties, and civil rights. Dr. David Oualaalou, as always, David, welcome back.
Pleasure to be with you, Wilmer.
Continuing with the Defense News report, this time, both countries are moving beyond ordinary military posturing. Iran is preparing for a fast, overwhelming strike, while Israel is strengthening its defenses, not only against ballistic missiles, but also developing new systems to intercept hypersonic weapons, a threat that could soon enter the Middle East battlefield. I think they've already been used. Yeah. How accurate are these reports? How concerned should people be? Dr. David Oualaalou.
Well, the concern, I mean, it's very concerning. It's not a laughing matter. It's very, very concerning, given the accuracy of what you stated. When you consider, for example, the United States now is in a process of preliminary steps of establishing a base in Gaza with the largest presence of U.S. troops. So the fundamental question becomes is, why are we establishing a base near Gaza for? What will that be for? And the logical answer tied to something outside the borders of Gaza, outside the borders of Israel, and pertain to Iran. And this one, because of the announcements by the Iranian IRGC elements, is that now it is prepared and has the capability of launching up to 2,000 missiles, as you stated at the beginning, all at once. Because remember, for your listeners, the 12-day June war, Iran only used about 500 missiles. And by the way, I had a chance to look at the footage inside Israel, which was not disclosed to the public or the people. It was a massive devastation. That doesn't mean that Iran didn't suffer devastation also, but it was massive in Israel. Why? Because the population in Israel is condensed, very dense in certain areas. You're looking at Ashkelon, Tel Aviv, certain key locations. And what made this very problematic for Israel is that Iranian missiles were able to penetrate the air defenses of Israel. And this is why the idea of launching 2,000 missiles all at once, one is to overwhelm the defense missile system. Two is to achieve a full destruction and immediate destruction, that is, because Iranians' missiles tends to be far more developed than what Ansarullah or Houthis have used. And we all know, we saw the images of Ansarullah Houthis missiles being, hitting the airports and some other infrastructure inside Iran. So in both, in Tel Aviv and in Tehran, there is this preparation for the next war. It will be naive of us to think that the next war ain't going to happen. There is also another element that is fueling this. It has to do with Iran ending its cooperation with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's because the latter tends to, meaning IAEA, tends to really manipulate the reports. And that is why Iran has reached now a decision to, okay, we're done with the cooperation. We still can negotiate with the Americans on the nuclear program. But again, how can you negotiate with the US government when the US government does not respect the conditions of contracts and so forth?
Does this indicate a shift in Iranian tactic and strategy, in that they have been very, very restrained up to this point in terms of responding to attacks by targeting the facilities that were responsible for the attacks, following the Quran and the restraints that Quran, or the conditions that the Holy Quran has relative to military action. But are they in this expanding the targeting to move beyond merely Israeli offensive positions and putting individuals and putting innocent civilians in harm's way?
Well, there is one concern inside Tehran, and I am certain a lot of analysts will agree with me on this, is that the government is thinking in terms, we have the two options here. One option is either to fight Israel directly, or we're going to have to forego that and deal with the negotiations with the Americans, because the sanctions, sort of to them, to the Iranian government, certain elements inside the IRGC, dealing with the sanctions will be much more preferable than dealing with Israel that way. Why? Because if you have a population that is starving, it tends to revolt against the government. The Iranian government doesn't want that. On the other hand, if you have an Iranian society that is being penetrated by the Asian Mossad agents and double agents and so forth, which, by the way, the Iranian just executed another cell. To my knowledge, 3 have been automatically executed because they confessed to their association with Mossad. To those elements inside IRGC saying, no, if you don't deal with Israel this way, then we will only expect more attacks. We will never be safe. And this is why I believe they have reached that conclusion of, let's prepare, overwhelming force, overwhelming weapons. Then we'll see. Israelis will think now twice about attacking Iran. I am certain of this. It's because what Iran disclosed about these 2,000 missiles tells me personally there is more than meet the eye. Iran will never disclose the full capability. And this is why Israel will be concerned about what if Iran end up deploying something that we are not aware of. And this is again where that element of the population is going to be in support of retaliating against Israel if Iran is attacked again. But Iran, on the other hand, doesn't want to take chance this time around. This is why they went ahead and beefed up their weapon systems. That includes certain types of certain missiles. For example, I'm aware of the MQ-9 from China, which is about between 2 to 230 kilometers. You have the S-400 missile systems from the Russians, which is about 400 kilometers. Then they went ahead and upgraded the radars. Then they went ahead and upgraded the fighter jets. They got the MiG-29 from the Russians, and they are about to receive the Su F-35, which is a multi-role fighter jets. I am also not ruling out another additional to this. It has to do with North Korea. North Korea missile capabilities. This is why we don't sort of, if I may use the term, mess around with North Korea, because they were able to develop those ICBMs on a long trajectory, long range. Iran ended up developing this, but I'm not surprised that if there will be some coordination behind closed doors between the North Koreans and the Iranians.
As I understand the analysis, the analysts are looking at, on the one hand, Iran is beefing up its offensive capabilities, as you've just articulated, missile production. They've got up to 2,000-kilometer ranges. They're talking, as we talked about, launching them simultaneously, a massive wave of missile fire, while it appears as though Israel's response is more defensive, strengthening stronger shields and smarter defensive weapons. Does any of Israel's defensive move have anything to do with the United States' inability to provide them with missiles because the United States has depleted its own stockpiles?
Well, that's an interesting question, because this morning, it was a conversation in Tel Aviv about extending now the security, American security to Israel for the next 20 years.
20 years, right.
Yeah, so that just happened this morning. So that tells me right there, this convinced me personally why the U.S. made the decision to go ahead and establish a military base in Gaza. I mean, otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You only have one objective, and one objective only is to protect Israel from the possibility of an Iran offensive operation if attacked. On the other hand, you're going to have to think in terms of Iran not trusting some Arab countries. And I'm talking about the Gulf states, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. As a matter of fact, even Saudi Arabia in itself, that was involved with Mossad inside Yemen, for example. This is why the Houthis end up, rooting out the cell that was sort of through the Saudis. All these elements is pushing Iran to ensure that it has and it's ready should Israel cross that line again by attacking Iran, and Iran will respond forcefully. As to the defense shield and so forth, it's been exposed. Israel has been exposed, because I used to hear it about 15 years ago or so. The Iron Dome is going to protect Israelis and so forth. During the 12-day war, and the missiles launched by the Houthis or Ansarullah proved that the Iron Dome ain't working. So the Israelis will have to depend on the U.S. in this matter.
You've mentioned Ansarullah a couple of times, and in the reports and things that I've been reading, I don't hear a lot of discussion about Ansarullah. And so as it relates to a conflict between Israel and Iran, with, of course, the United States on the side of Israel, is Ansarullah just a wild card here? Because they have demonstrated their ability with hypersonics. They have demonstrated their ability to weigh in and to be a force that has to be reckoned with here.
Well, Ansarullah right now is in a better position, believe it or not, to sort of regroup and reorganize where their capability is going to be. Mark my word on it. Should there be a war again between Iran and Israel, Ansarullah will step in. Hezbollah just disclosed that it will not lay down its arms no matter what happened, which is a foregone conclusion, because that was the objective for the U.S. envoy, what's his name, Barak, who ended up going to both, because they wanted the Lebanese government, Michel Aoun, the president wants him to disarm Hezbollah. You won't be able to, because members of Hezbollah are a major party within the parliaments. So this is why Hezbollah and Ansarullah will remain the wild cards for Iran. Add to this, you have other militias or groups, armed groups inside Iraq. We shouldn't rule that out. But the whole idea of why you don't hear much about the Houthis or Ansarullah right now is because, first of all, Israel is not attacking Yemen anymore, because Israel have learned the lesson that if it attacks Ansarullah or fire in Yemen or bomb whatever location, Ansarullah will not bluff and will not hesitate to retaliate. This is why, in my opinion, Israel doesn't want to open that front again, because they saw what happened and they kind of been left alone, because the U.S., we all know, the U.S. had an aircraft carrier in the Red Sea, but we end up moving it further north for fear that the Ansarullah might end up receiving some advanced type of torpedoes or some advanced types of missiles that could destroy or sink the aircraft carrier. And that will be bad news for the United States. So this is how I see it playing out.
You just mentioned Iraq, and they had elections, I think, yesterday.
Correct.
And Muqtada al-Sadr basically did not participate, his faction participated on a very, very limited basis.
Yeah.
They are Shia, as are the Iranians. So are there dynamics there that that need to be taken into account? I mean, in terms of you've got Yemen, now you've got to look at Iraq as well.
Well, for sure, you have to consider Iraq also another wild card, but not with the government, but rather with the armed groups, and those armed groups are mainly Shia. Here is where the problem that Soudani, the current prime minister, which most likely might not succeed in becoming a president, is that for a Sadr party or group not to participate fully, that gives me an idea that they are not happy with the government's decision to force the militias to lay down their arms. Why? Because that was one of the conditions for the withdrawal of the U.S. Sort of the U.S. put the condition on the Soudani, the prime minister of Iraq, hey, if you want us to go out. Well, to me, it's a problem to begin with, because if we are to look at Iraq as a sovereign state, it has the right to decide which country it wants, forces wants to have on its soil or not. I mean, we look at what Niger did when it asked the U.S. to pack and leave. And he gave a window of about 2 months, if I'm not mistaken. He said, by the end of this period, we need you to be out of Niger permanently. And that's exactly what happened. Soudani, the prime minister of Iraq, is not a forceful leader. So he is not that strong individual who can say to the Americans, you know what, we need you to be out. We done, your time here is over, and all that. This is the reason why Sadr decided to limit the participation, because Sadr holds a major sway inside domestic politics of Iraq. In addition to being a Shia faction, you can put the two and two together and figure out it's going to be in support of Iran one way or another.
So following along that, what you've just laid out, how does this decision or this discussion about the United States building another base in the region, how does this play out with a number of the other Arab countries, particularly some of those with a more quote unquote radical bent? Yeah. We know if we go back to Osama bin Laden, one of his major complaints and issues was the boots of the infidel on Islamic soil. So does this exacerbate a problem? What your thoughts on that?
No, it will not. It will not, Wilmer. Okay. It's because you have weak leaders in Arab states as we speak. And when I say Arab states, I'm referring to the main ones in the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, and so forth. All of them, their survival depends on the U.S. security. I mean, literally, without America, there will be no monarchies and so forth. And when you look at the presence of another base in Gaza, they won't be able to say anything about it because they have no say into that. This is what most Arabs needs to understand, especially Arab population needs to understand that their leaders have no say into the decisions that the United States, for example, just decided on establishing a military base on Gaza's border. So, how about Egypt? Egypt is not going to react to this.
Right.
You might only expect some sort of statement, but even with that, I don't see it coming forth. It's from Turkey, because Turkey has other calculations, strategic ones, pertain to its presence inside Gaza. This is why Israelis are vehemently opposed to the presence of Turkish forces on Gaza as part of the international force. But the idea of this presence of the U.S. military, which again makes you just wonder, given what American families are struggling with the shutdown, we are going ahead and establishing another base that's going to cost God only knows how many millions of dollars, if not billions for that. Makes you just wonder, why will the U.S. will do that if it is not to ensure a next preparation against Iran? That's the only way I see it going that direction.
So do you see the next strike by the United States on Iran, is the timing of that have to have anything to do with the development of this base? Or so will the United States wait until they've got a base there, or are those things independent?
No, actually it makes more sense. The latter will make perfect sense. You have to wait till you have your base at least to have a close proximity, because remember, it's all about the proximity. And when we found out, when the Iranian were able to target, you remember the Al-Udeid base in Qatar, the Iranian didn't hesitate to target that. So that means for the US, if it has another alternative base, of course, we have a base in Jordan, we have a base in Saudi Arabia. Those are not known. And I'm not sharing something classified here. It's if you know where to look, you will be able to find it. But those are not known. But the one on Gaza is because it will be known, the U.S. military base near Gaza. But this way, the U.S. is thinking in terms of having an alternative to Al-Udeid base in Qatar, because we are out of Iraq. Now, even with this, the United States government is considering now another base. Where this base is going to be? It's going to be in Syria. This is why you had Giuliani being received in a White House to get the marching orders and move forward. What's surprisingly about that, even despite his visit and the lifting of sanctions against him and Syria and so forth, the Russian president reached out to Giuliani, because Syria has always been Russia's sphere of influence. But now the U.S. wants to have base, and that ain't exactly because, once again, my thinking, it has to do with Iran. They wanted to ensure the presence with the military base, meaning the U.S., with the military base in Gaza, with the presence in Syria, and of course with Israel controlling the Golan Heights, that will never be given up to Syria, because Giuliani is hoping that he will enter into negotiations with Israel regarding the Golan Heights. I don't see that happening.
So does the United States stating that it's planned to build a base, now you're talking boots on the ground. So does that indicate a different strategy with the next conflict or next anticipated conflict with Iran? One of the things that I remember very clearly, Minister Farrakhan saying before the Gulf War, he said, "You can't win this with your technology." He said, you've got this for the first couple of weeks with your missiles. He said, but eventually you're going to have to bring your soldiers in here. And when you bring your soldiers in here, that's when the tide starts to turn. So back in June, there was this 12-day missiles back and forth. now building a base, does that mean that the United States is planning to bring their soldiers into the game?
Well, the only answer to that, Warmer, depend on how many soldiers will be based on will be stationed at that base. So as of now, there is no confirmation as to the number of troops. Of course, it doesn't make any sense for the U.S. to disclose the number of troops. You never disclose the number of troops going to be stationed at a particular base. But yeah, it makes sense. But the idea of we thinking that we could do to Iran what we did to Iraq, it will be foolishness. It will be complete foolishness, because
but isn't complete foolishness what we're looking at already?
Well, yeah, well, this it is already. It's just for the U.S. is to keep the narrative alive. It's no different than what we're doing in Ukraine. We know that we are not going to defeat the Russians. That's just common sense. But we have to keep the narrative alive. In my opinion, the presence of whatever number of the U.S. troops on that base in Gaza, that will be mainly to protect Israel. That's for Israel protection directly there. Instead of, because we can't think of it in terms of, well, you're going to have now troops on ground that's going to go ahead and march into Iran. No, we couldn't even do it in Yemen. And I've been in Yemen. Yemen terrain is so rugged.
Yes.
There is no way. We had some special ops here and there, but even with that, it didn't cut it. It's those terrains are very, very, very hard. It's no different than what it was in Afghanistan. Iran is even more complicated, because if you go into North Kurdistan, and I remember I was in North Kurdistan and I'm looking from the border, across the border, it's just mountains, rugged terrain. How are you going to put troops on that? So you're going to have a landing zone and all that. Well, once you have a landing zone, you are a target. So this is why I am convinced, Wilmer, that the presence of the U.S. forces in this so supposedly a U.S. base in Gaza is going to mainly for the protection of Israel.
You mentioned Jelani coming to the White House. I had talked about that in terms of that just demonstrates the total moral bankruptcy, not only of the Trump administration, but of American foreign policy. And also the whole idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And how many leaders have to suffer from that, from believing in that logic, before they come to understand that, as Kissinger is supposed to have said, being an American enemy is dangerous, being an American ally is fatal.
Well, Julian is going to find out. As a matter of fact, there has been, to my knowledge, 2 attempts already on his life. So, and this came from ISIS groups. So that tells me right there is a disparity. There is some sort of a new faction that is emerging somewhere on the landscape in the Syrian domestic politics that is going to be opposing to this rapprochement between Syria and the U.S. Because we want to head right now. As a matter of fact, I saw a picture this morning of the head of the IMF with Giuliani. That tells you right there, we're going to put a loan, suck them into debt, control the oil, control the passage way for that oil to go wherever we want it, and limit the influence of Russia inside Syria. That is the bigger objective. And of course, protect the Golan Heights that stays always under the control of Israel. Giuliani, I'm not saying he miscalculated. He knew what he's getting into. But also he knew that the day he agreed with both the U.S. and Israel to move forward, he's going to have to deal with the consequences of that decision moving forward the next few months or so.
He's going to have to deal with the consequences of that decision. I got another question based on that, but let me thank Robert Brown for his $5 super sticker. Robert, thank you very, very much for that generous contribution. So when you look at Jelani's calculations, you look at the terrorist head chopper that he was, $10 million bounty on his head. He now, for all intents and purposes, switches teams.
Yeah.
So I understand what that does for him relative to the IMF, relative to the elite in the West. But then what does that do? How does that impact his perception and his reality within his former comrades that he was in concert with against the infidel. He's now become one.
Yeah, well, of course, they're not gonna let it go. They're not gonna let it go. He might win support from the Syrian people. And when I say Syrian people, those that were opposed to the Assad regime.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not denying Assad didn't, or his father Hafez al-Assad, they didn't do well by the Syrians. You know, let's just be honest and straightforward about this. But on the other hand, Israel understood back then that it is better to have a stable regime in Damascus for its own security, meaning the security of Israel. Why? Because they know back then, or they knew back then, that sort of they could expect what the Assad will do and not do. So in other words, they had an understanding. Now with this guy, with Julani, all of a sudden that is flipping on his group, as you mentioned earlier. They're not going to be certain, meaning the Israelis in this case, first. And of course, the government inside Damascus is not going to be certain that they can maintain a security across the country. So what you're going to be seeing moving forward, you're going to be seeing certain protectorates, certain areas. In other words, Syria might end up being divided, which will be bad news moving forward if that ever happens.
Syria might wind up being divided and split. And split how?
Because you will have, remember, in Syria, there are a lot of ethnic groups. You have the Shiites, the Maronite, the Druze, the Alawite, the Sunni, and so forth. Right. But you have also the Maronite, which, by the way, now Israel is supporting. Now, I won't be surprised that Israel will push for the narrative of, how about if we give them a state? Even they might be as small as it can be. That will be a window for Israel to ensure that it can always have access inside Syria. The Druze, I'm sorry, not the Maronite. It was the Druze. That's the Israelis were supporting. Then you have the Sunnis. Then you have the Shiites. Then you have the Alawite. Right. Alawites were avid supporters of the Assad regimes. They're not going to let go, of course, what now Julani is doing. And adding more of fuel to the fire is the idea, that picture of Julani inside the White House. You know, that just, first of all, on their end, it's bad on his end, but also for us, we're saying we don't negotiate with terrorists, and all of a sudden you are welcoming one inside. But that's, again, the name of the game when it comes down to international relations. You know, sometimes today you'll be fighting with an enemy, tomorrow you might be shaking hands with.
One element that you didn't mention in that discussion is Turkey and the elements that within Syria that Turkey has been fighting. Yeah. So I would think they would factor into this. If you're talking about a split within Syria, that some of those factions would weigh into this as well.
Well, that's for sure, Wilmer. I mean, actually, it's an excellent point, because Ankara is not losing its sights on really the developments that's taking. They are watching now this rapprochement between Syria and the U.S. government / Israel with concern. Why? Because they have always been a role into Turkey regarding that part of the world. Their main concern, even though the PKK have laid down these arms, they are now more concerns inside Syria regarding what kind of political landscape are we going to be dealing with. Turkey doesn't want to take a chance into all this. And this is why one of the elements you can tell the tensions behind closed doors is when Israel vehemently opposed the presence of Turkey's forces in Gaza as part of the international force.
Before we move on to our next topic, I need to make a point to my audience. I do pay attention to the stream and to the comments, and folks, some of y'all may not agree with what we're saying.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But we are serious about our business. And so when you come into the chat and you start just injecting foolishness and idiocy into the conversation, we're not going to tolerate that. So a couple of folks for the day have been sent to the showers, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Because again, folks, we're here talking serious business, and I'm not a political operative. I'm a political scientist. And Dr. Oualaalou, he takes his business seriously. I take my business seriously. That's why we're on here having these conversations. So if I'm gonna treat y'all like I treat the students in my class. You bring in silly, you take the silly outside. So with that having been said, and I'm not even gonna humor them by mentioning who they are. They know who they are. And with that being said, let's turn the focus to Venezuela. And Latin Times reports Nobel laureate Machado warns Venezuela is living, quote, decisive hours, end quote. I say one of the reasons why she didn't win it, she was given the Nobel Prize, is so that she could be labeled as Venezuelan opposition leader 2025 Nobel Prize laureate Maria Corina Machado. So now that gives her a level of credibility that otherwise she didn't have. Let me first, before we get into the details what your thoughts on that basically she can now become, or she can be heralded as some legitimate voice of reason when all she's really been and continues to be is a U.S. regime change operative?
Well, first of all, Wilmer, the Nobel Prize Committee, it has been degraded anyway. Its credibility has been degraded. If your viewers know a little bit about literature winners, one of them was back in 1964. His name is Jean-Paul Sartre. He was from France. He's the one who turned it down. And he turned it down for a reason that he does not want to become institutionalized through that kind of, he wanted to let his work speak for him. He was the first one to turn it down, and a lot of people respected him for that. So Nobel Peace Prize, it's as corrupted as it can get. So, and for Maria Machado, for now to have that title, that just adds to the sort of to lack of credibility, not only for her, but also for that entity. What a lot of your viewers needs to understand is the long relationship that existed between Machado and the U.S. government. And it goes way back to 2003, 4, and specifically 5, when she was granted an audience with George Bush for 15 minutes at that time. So the idea that she's all of a sudden now coming out, as a matter of fact, just to let you know, she was the one behind pushing the narrative for Trump to start using the term narco trafficker leader or narco trafficker organization. She pushed for that because if you look at the history of the US in Latin America, we used the same terminology against Manuel Antonio Noriega. Right. All of a sudden, we turned on him when he said he opposed the US involvement in Latin America. For Maria Machado, what gives me more concern than anything else is what she said for an interview, that if she becomes a president, the first order of business is going to be to move the Venezuelan embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That to me was problematic to begin with. But also, I had to call in some favors to find out a few things, and I found out that she signed an agreement with Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud party.
Oh, really?
Yes. A lot of people do not know, and it's not disclosed openly, by the way. And it's not classified what I'm sharing here. And that makes you put the two and two together and figure why she won the Nobel Peace Prize. That is the whole reason. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump was tipped off prior to the announcement.
So she signed an agreement with Netanyahu to do what?
To support the propositions for the movement
Okay.
of the Venezuelan embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem, because that's problematic because the capital of Israel that is known under UN charters is Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem. And the reason why Israel wants to take over is Jerusalem. We all know. We're not going to get into the details of, but that gives you an idea of how Machado, which by the way, been financed by NED, the National Endowment of Art, been financed by the agency, by CIA. It's not a secret. There is a long history there. All of a sudden, pushing for this. I am sure you're aware of the failed attempt to kidnap Maduro.
Yes.
Yeah. So that idea was hatched.
Wait a minute. Which one? The one with the where they tried to convince the pilots?
That is correct.
Okay. Yes.
But one specific pilot is it General
Lopez?
Variaga, I don't remember his name exactly. But the idea is that which the operation was hatched between DHS, it was a former employee there, and a former employee of the U.S. Embassy who was in the Marines, then it became attached to DHS and the CIA. But things didn't work out because the pilots refused the $15 million offer. And that gives you an idea right there, because the objective for Machado, Corina, that is now to push this narrative of, you look, the Venezuelan people are suffering economically. We're going to need to do this and that. It's no different than what Guaido did back in 2019. The first thing they did was they used the trucks through the borders and create chaos inside to tell the global world that look what socialism is doing to the poor Venezuelans. They have nothing to eat and so forth, which was none of that happening. Which, by the way, I don't know if you know this. He teaches in Florida State University.
Yes.
I mean, with no credentials, man. That's an insult to education.
Yes, it is. It is but it also shows you the lengths to which the administrations will go to pay off their acolytes, their puppets, their emissaries. But then also that they can just as quickly as they back you, they can kill you.
That is true,
and that's what Jelani needs to understand. That
I'm sure
that if he thinks that he's leveraging something, no, he's merely a tool. And when he serves no useful purpose,
that's it.
He'll be the has-been that never was.
That is correct.
So looking at the movement of the Gerald Ford into the Caribbean Sea and the battle group, how concerned are you that this will move from being a threat to being a real mission? And what we hear Russia saying, we're going to back Maduro. We're hearing Petro in Colombia saying we're going to back Maduro. Does this become a regional conflagration? What do you see?
Well, first of all, from a military perspective, Walmart, the movements of the U.S. naval assets only represents about 10%. That's it. 10%. You can't get into a country with 10%. Second thing, you're going to need to have troops on the ground. How are you going to do that when Venezuela this morning just mobilized 200,000 fighters, both militias, civilians, and the military combined? And if you add Colombian to that, how does the U.S. thinks that's going to figure it out? Second thing, with the Russians sending certain types of missiles, those are advanced systems. The U.S. we're going to have now to think twice about, do they want to start seeing planes falling or even the aircraft itself attacked? Because like I always say, in international relations, context matters. The fact that you have Gerald Ford aircraft carrier being attacked or launched at, that's enough message to send to I don't think so as of now. Donald Trump tends to sort of use the hyper words, if
hyperbolic.
Yeah, it's just he's not going to. It's because the facts on the ground doesn't support that argument. 10% of your force, in Venezuela. And Latin America is no small matter.
Mhm.
Our special ops that have been there in Latin America did not end up achieving much. It's I just don't see that happening. So the question that I will have on all this is whether China is going to get involved behind the scenes or not. And
Mhm.
the reason for that, Wilmer, is because China also gets massive amount of oil from Venezuela.
Mhm. Mhm. So, as I've been looking at this, if the United States were to be irresponsible enough
Mhm.
and foolish enough to
Mhm.
do something militarily in Venezuela, I could see Russia's response being a military response and China's response being an economic response based upon the amount of American currency, the amount of American debt. Or China could just decide we're going to flood the market. We're gonna impact the value of the dollar, and we're going to impact your economy while Russia is dealing with your military.
Well, you're absolutely correct, Wilmer, because if I've learned anything for the last 40 years or so, is that if you want to destroy a country, just destroy its economy. You don't need to fight. You don't need to fight it. Just destroy the economy. And that's exactly that perfect point. I couldn't agree more. The one thing that I will also keep an eye on is whether the Russians will send any type of special op units.
Okay.
Now, if I see that, then I'm going to see an uptick into the confrontation.
Now, is that something that they would make known publicly?
No.
Okay, so
No, they won't.
you would see that based upon your contacts and what you know.
That is correct, and
Okay.
usually we'll see that close to the circles of Maduro and so forth. Those will not be the fighter force per se on the ground. Those will be much more a bigger picture to ensure the stability of the regime. So far there is none of that.
So how seriously do you take Petro's comments, and what impact, if he decided to weigh in on this, what impact do you think would that be would that impact the balance of power?
Well, actually, inside Colombia, there are voices against that particular statement from Gustavo Petro.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if he moves forward with that, that tells me right there that's almost history coming a full circle. Because what are the three countries that we end up not able to influence much? Venezuela, Colombia, and Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised that a third party will come in to join the fight behind the scenes. And usually those countries in the region, they tend to have militias beside the military. So if Gustavo stated something like that, that tells me that he's already have a force in place that is not necessarily the military, but it will be a militia type.
Well, and adding to that, you're talking about three countries that are steeped in revolution and that have had successful, you talk about Nicaragua, Colombia, and Venezuela. You're talking about three presidents that came out of revolution, and they understand the dynamics in what they're not chicken hawks. They understand the reality of conflict because they came out, similar to Zimbabwe and Mugabe in Zimbabwe. He came out of the bush as they are coming out of the jungle.
Yeah, and that's how exactly I see it moving forward. So the US, with all these movements and so forth, we tend to do this a lot. Remember when we started against the Ansarullah, we were saying we're going to disseminate them completely or turn them to Stone Age and all that. Where is all that? We end up moving the aircraft carrier, bring it from here and there. It was nothing but for show. The moment you start to see missiles being fired, we end up giving the order to the at the time it was Eisenhower, I believe, the aircraft carrier, to move up north. It wasn't a mechanical issue because the Pentagon report, and I read that, it stated what it was a mechanical, they needed to do some mechanical stuff. It had nothing to do with mechanical stuff. It was because the concern that we're seeing that this is a type of a group that ain't gonna back down. They don't fear death. They will fight. And if you start having missiles falling on the aircraft carrier, it's bad news. So move it up further north, And once they did, there was no issue with that. But same thing in Venezuela. I see all these movements, it might not amount to anything. Who's to say? With Trump, you never know. But we have enough problems here at home that Trump is already kind of lost in the wilderness as to what do you expect? It's Trump. What do you expect from a guy like that?
And final question for you as we wrap this up, and I always greatly appreciate your time and your
Of course
analysis. Because I don't think we've talked about the outcome of the off-year elections and the trouncing that the Republicans suffered, and now we look at what transpired last night with the vote to reopen the government. And your thoughts on my point. The Democrats may have lost the battle, but they could in terms of the healthcare issue.
You mean the Republican?
No. The Democrats, seven Democrats and one independent in the Senate sided with the Republicans.
To
reopen the war.
You're right.
And they didn't get the healthcare benefit that they were looking for. So a lot of people are now seeing this as a loss.
Yeah.
But the Republicans are going to have to address this issue by the end of the year, or else so many Americans, and a lot of them in red states, their healthcare costs are going to go through. I heard a woman say last night, her husband has Parkinson's, she has cancer, and if their healthcare benefits go up from, I think it was $800 a month to almost $100 and something thousand a year.
Wow.
And they only make $48,000.
Wow.
So the Republicans the Democrats may have lost this battle.
Yeah.
But they could very well wind up, if they play it right, forcing the hand of the Republicans and win the war. I know that's a whole lot of jabbering from me. Your thoughts?
No, you're absolutely correct, Wilmer. It's just the idea of this shutdown now. A lot of Americans think, well, the shutdown is over. No, yeah, it is over, but the fundamental issues have not been resolved.
Correct.
The political squabbling still exists. It's not over yet. You don't know what we might end up facing by the end of the year. What is certain is that what we witnessed, for example, the election of Mamdani in New York, the election of the first governor female in Virginia, which is usually, those are hints as to what lies ahead for the political trajectory. Here in Texas, there is now a massive pushback against the Republicans. So, as a matter of fact, I had behind me somewhere, I don't know what it was, I bought a T-shirt that says Republic of Texas because we start circulating them here. So I bought one.
Now, see, I said about 15 years ago, I was looking at demographic shifts from California into Arizona, and I said Californians, retirees, and others are moving out of California into Arizona, and we look at the rise of the Hispanic population. I said Arizona's going to go Democrat, and I said Texas won't necessarily go Democrat, but the Republicans are going to have to spend a lot more time, effort, and money to keep Texas red, and I see that happening now.
Well, it is a lot of conversation right now, and actually we see it on the ground that a lot of people are pissed with the Republicans.
Where is Beto O'Rourke in all of? Is he still a force, or has he basically
he faded away?
Oh, he faded away. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
all right.
they're looking at new faces here at the same time. But at the same time, I'm looking at the recent elections, and it gives you the increase of the minorities. That's That's to me an indication for what lies ahead. Moving.
You got a Muslim that won in New York. You've got a Muslim
correct.
female, Indian female that won in Virginia.
Virginia.
Yeah. The dynamic is shifting.
Yeah, and
Dr. David Oualaalou, thank you so much for your time, my brother. Greatly appreciate it. As always, look forward to having you back.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye. All right. Hey, folks, I got to say again, and I just, where'd my thing go here? Yeah, I need to say again, you don't have to agree. Hell, I don't agree with everything I say. So, but respect the work, respect the effort, respect the analysis. So when you come on here and you decide that you want to use this as your personal clown show, no, that's disrespectful. And you're disrespecting the group, you're disrespecting me, you're disrespecting my guests. There are a number of other platforms you can go to where your silliness and your foolishness will be greatly appreciated. This is not the space. So, because again, I consider this, and I consider my Sirius XM show to be an extension of my classroom. And I would never tolerate a student in my, and not saying you all are students here, but I'm saying in the context of a classroom, I would never tolerate that kind of disrespect, especially if I'm bringing in a guest speaker to my class to facilitate a conversation. I would never appreciate that level of disrespect. So I had put up with it long enough, and it got to a point where, I mean, I don't even remember what the comment was, but there was some silly comment that this is not the place. So with that, we're gonna move forward. Thank you all very much for listening and participating in the exchange today. The Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Brother Tom Porter is going to join us tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. As always, when you listen to Tom, you're listening to some serious analysis. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, have a blessed remainder of your day. I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.